Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary films, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, essays, watch lists, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. This November, here in London, we've been enjoying the opportunity to revisit the works of one of Russian cinema's most long-standing grandees, with a retrospective of the films of Aleksandr Sokurov, organised by the Cultural Institute Pushkin House. Best known in the West for his 2002 epic Russian Ark, Sokurov has been pursuing his unique brand of dream-like cinema in features, shorts and documentaries since the end of the 1970s, with his latest film Fairy Tale receiving a UK premiere as part of this retrospective. Sokurov is arguably the last living embodiment of the figure of the classic Russian arthouse director, in all of its contradictions. His heritage stretches back to Andrei Tarkovsky and forward to contemporary figures like Kantemir Balagov, and he has a complicated, sometimes problematic relationship to Russian military and imperial power and history. To make sense of Sokurov in 2024, I spoke with the film historian, curator and broadcaster Ian Christie. Ian has been working on and with Sokurov since the 1980s and was involved in bringing his films to the UK for the first time during Perestroika. You may also remember him from our conversation about the Soviet avant-garde in the first season of the Klassiki Podcast. You can find out more about the Sokurov retrospective by following the links in the show description. Ian Christie, thank you for rejoining us on the Klassiki Podcast to talk all things Sokurov.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much, Sam. I'm amazed that Sokurov's films, which seem to have dropped out of view in recent years, have come back in this rather wonderful retrospective at the ICA.
You're our first returning champion on the podcast, and we had to have you on to try and crack the nut, as it were, of Sokurov, because, like you say, he's a filmmaker who had somewhat disappeared from view, from taste, and having this opportunity to rewatch his films and to kind of reconsider where a figure like Sokurov and all of the kind of connotations that go along with him, where he sits now in this kind of changed world, this changed attitude towards Russia and Russian culture, I think is super interesting. But like I say, we had to ask you to come and talk about Sokurov because you have a kind of direct relationship with his works going back several decades at this point. So why don't we start off by just you telling us about how you kind of encountered Sokurov in the 80s and how you came to bring him to Britain during Perestroika.
Well, he was part of a new wave of Soviet filmmakers that was there to be discovered, if you like, at the beginning of the 80s. And in the case of Sokurov, he arrives on the scene in the early 80s with a film. I think his breakthrough film really was a film that's got so many different translations of its title. It's either called Anesthesia Dolorosa or Painful Indifference or Heartbreak House. Take your pick.
Well, Heartbreak House is the name of the Bernard Shaw play that it's an adaptation of.
It's sort of adaptation of, yes. I called it Heartbreak House when I showed it at the National Film Theatre in the 80s, and I immediately got a letter from the Shaw estate saying this appears to be an unauthorized adaptation of a Shaw work.
The message hadn't reached the Soviet Union about intellectual
absolutely
copyright
not
at that point.
No, not at all. And in fact, when Sokurov came to I invited him along with Kira Muratova and a number of other filmmakers. When he came in the 80s, I took him to George Bernard Shaw's house because he was very interested. I said, where would you like to go? And we went out to Ayotte St. Lawrence, to the Shaw estate, as it were. And it turned out that Sokurov knew an enormous amount about Shaw, although his film is not a very precise adaptation of the play. He knew everything about Shaw. He said, show me the tree which Shaw fell from. And the curator of Shaw's house was astonished at this Russian who seemed to know so much about him. And he was really interested to actually see with his own eyes where Shaw had lived. So that was a kind of surprise to me as well. And Sokurov has really gone on surprising me in lots of ways ever since. When I look back at the twists and turns of his career, we had him fixed at one point after that film. After Heartbreak House, he was making a film like Days of the Eclipse, an extraordinary film set in the Soviet sort of Far East. Very interesting vision of a kind of wasteland, inspired, I think, by his own childhood as the son of a military family.
I believe it was shot in the village or the town in Turkmenistan where he had spent some time.
That's right. Yes, I believe it was. And I showed that to Frederick Jameson, for instance, who sadly has just died fairly recently, who was very interested in new Soviet cinema at the time. And Fred wrote a wonderful essay, very much inspired by his viewing of Days of the Eclipse, which, that became a really important film for many of us because it was a completely new kind of film, Tarkovskian to an extent, but not Tarkovsky. And for a long time, Sokurov's reputation had to kind of get out from under him being seen as a disciple of Tarkovsky.
Well, that's the case with so many Russian directors who are a little slower than average, shall we say.
Well, in his particular case, he wrote a text which I published in a journal here, which is his own very personal testimony of his relationship with Tarkovsky.
Well, they were close friends.
Well, no.
No. Okay.
If you believe this text, and I think I do, and I've talked to him about it as well, and we did a number of interviews together through an interpreter, and I think I don't think he was that close. He was very impressed by Tarkovsky, and Tarkovsky certainly saw him very much as a kind of, as a fellow traveler, as a very sympathetic figure. And he tells the story. I don't know if it's widely known. He tells the story of how Tarkovsky, he was suffering from some terrible splitting headache or something, and Tarkovsky said, "I have the power to heal," and pressed his hands to his temple. And then he said, Tarkovsky, has that helped? And I think Sokurov said, well, it hadn't really helped, but he wanted to please him. So I think there was that sort of sense of him feeling that Tarkovsky had an aura about him, and Sokurov wasn't entirely going along with that. Well, he was, but he really wanted to make it clear that he was not exactly a disciple. I mean, he certainly felt the liberation of form and subject matter too, which Tarkovsky had brought into Soviet cinema. But he was very much always his own man, following very different directions. And when I look back at the filmography, there are so many sort of periods in Sokurov's career where you think you've got him pigeonholed, and then he goes off and does something completely different.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably try and weave some kind of path through his career. I'm really interested, just while we're on this kind of this trip down memory lane, what was he like? I mean, I'm sure his personality has changed in the preceding years, but what was he like when you met him in London back then?
I first met him in Riga during the Avant-Garde Festival there in '88, when it's the late Soviet Union. Things are getting very sort of rocky, and a bunch of people in Riga are running an avant-garde festival, and Sokurov is one of the guests of honor. And I met him there too, and he was very much in the spotlight as a poster boy for perestroika, if you like. He was, willing to speak his mind, speak very freely, and so forth. In London, he was willing to be really quite stroppy on stage. I remember I had a very, very difficult on stage event at the NFT with Kira Muratova, who was also not a pushover, and Sokurov, and they started disagreeing quite fiercely
Oh dear.
about the way forward. But I mean, the important thing is that it was a time when Soviet filmmakers, as they still were, felt an increasing ability to speak freely and to be themselves. And that really hadn't happened before. When Tarkovsky first came to London at the beginning of the 80s, he was like a sort of frightened rabbit. He didn't feel he could say anything because he had his KGB minder watching him from the front row. So he knew that he had to be very, very discreet. Sokurov and Muratova and others like that did not feel that, and Klimov, of course. They felt they could speak very freely in the late 80s during that great period. The only one who really made the transition wholly successfully, I would say, from the Soviet period into the post-Soviet period really was Sokurov, who again embarked on a whole new course of production with significant support from especially Germany and Rotterdam, and all sorts of Western bastions of the avant-garde were willing to support this very exciting filmmaker in his very striking aesthetic and technical experiments.
So yeah, we've got. So at this point, he is really just kind of embarking on a full kind of directorial career. Sorry, because he had graduated from the Geek Film School at the end of the 70s, but his diploma film, The Lonely Voice of Man, which was shown as part of this retrospective, had been banned, and he'd basically, struggled until the kind of full advent of perestroika to get anything produced in the Soviet Union. And then, like you say, he becomes kind of recognized as part of this new wave in this kind of very late Soviet period with films like Days of Eclipse, which was from the end of the 80s, and then into the 90s he starts to be kind of, as you say, picked up in the West and to really kind of embark on his filmmaking career.
The breakthrough film, if I can just drop this in, is Mother and Son, of course.
Yeah.
Mother and Son had an absolutely extraordinary response. So that's 1996. And the film was widely shown at festivals, and it attracted the most extraordinary number of admirers. I remember Paul Schrader was very vocal in supporting it. Scorsese spoke up and said how much he admired it. Many really significant Western filmmakers, international filmmakers, saw Mother and Son as an absolutely extraordinary film. And it is an extraordinary film too. But I think it collected a range of admiring responses, unlike any Russian film since Tarkovsky, indeed.
I think that's a film, in my mind, Mother and Son is kind of the high point of this, let's say, first stage of Sokurov's artistry, which you can maybe kind of trace from Days of Eclipse through to, say, Mother and Son or Father and Son, a film he made at the beginning of the 21st century, which is this refinement of this slow, allegorical, quite oniric, dreamlike cinema with very kind of stripped back plots, as it were, which obviously, a Russian filmmaker making films like that is always going to, as we say, attract comparisons to Tarkovsky. But with Sokurov here, there's I don't know if nihilism is the right word, but there's a kind of spiritual cynicism to it, which I think fits with that post-Soviet 90s kind of sense of crisis and also distances him from Tarkovsky.
Yes, and there's also an eroticism, which I think people find both exciting and disturbing. I mean, the relationship between the mother and the son is an extraordinary, intense, close relationship. They're only the two characters in Mother and Son, and they're in this strange landscape where it's like they're sharing a dream. think the dreamlike quality, it's very dreamlike indeed, of course, is emphasized by the fact that Sokurov starts to do some very interesting, technical is a bad word to use, but he starts to distort the image. And his device initially in Mother and Son is to play around with mirrors. Actually, he uses literally distorting mirrors in a number of films at this time, and then he starts to get into digital transformations, of course, of the image as well.
Yeah, there's almost a kind of American avant-garde heritage there, isn't it? A kind of Stan Brakhage or...
Yeah, absolutely. The distorted image, the distorted landscapes of Mother and Son look forward to the sorts of amazing distortions, both of figures and of settings, that he will do in the 2000s when it becomes increasingly possible. So he's a very early adopter of distorting the image, let's just call it that, at the service of a kind of ultra expressionistic aesthetic.
So yeah, like you say, he's developing this style that is quite familiar or at least kind of palatable to a Western art house audience. One thing I think is very interesting about Sokurov, and is probably important to talk about if we're taking a more kind of wide angle retrospective look back over his career, is that he's made a lot more documentaries and a lot more documentary shorts than he has feature films. It's not that he's been an unproductive feature filmmaker, but he's made a huge number of documentary shorts. He made them in the Soviet period, and he's continued to make them since. And a couple of these have been screened as part of this Pushkin House retrospective. They often bear the subtitle of Elegy.
Yes.
So what can we say about his documentary work, his shorts work, these elegies, and what they add to our understanding of him as a filmmaker?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that we have this distinction between it's either a feature film, a fiction film, or a documentary, because I think for Sokurov, that would probably be the wrong kind of distinction. They're shorts, let's say, and I think, of course, he came out of his actual place of employment when he began work as a filmmaker was Lendok, the documentary studio
in Leningrad.
So in a sense, he comes out of that background. And it's important just to mention in passing that there was a huge variety of types of production within the field of documentary in the Soviet period. People who were interested in Soviet cinema used to say, look at the documentaries. That's where you find greatest freedom of treatment. And in a way, Sokurov takes that relative freedom that the makers of documentary had and runs with it. The films are kind of cheaper, quicker to make. And he hits on the idea relatively early on of calling them elegies. The first one is actually called Elegy, Elegeia. And that's 86? It's really very early on indeed. And I think there is something very elegiac about his treatment of many themes, which is perhaps why he starts to call these films elegies. He makes a film about Tarkovsky, for instance, which has got various titles. It's called the Moscow Elegy is one title of it, and it's a sort of memorial film for Tarkovsky, made after Tarkovsky's death, when Russian, still Soviet cinema is mourning the loss of its greatest filmmaker who has died in exile. So that sort of theme about how much Russian culture lost because of forcing out its great artists comes back again and again.
I think that this recurring title of Elegy is instructive because there is something about a kind of idea of, I guess, Russian cultural history that is important to him, that he feels the need to return to. I mean, I wasn't going to bring up Russian Ark because I personally am not a huge fan of that film, to put it euphemistically. But since we're talking about this, for Western audiences, the film for which he's by far the best known would be Russian Ark from the turn of the millennium, which is famously a kind of a tour through the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and through kind of Russian cultural history, constructed out of a single unedited shot. So there he's really literally kind of taking you on a tour through Russian cultural history. But
a very particular and partial tour. I mean, I think
that's the polite way of putting it.
Yeah, it is. I think I introduced that film and discussed it with audiences more than almost any other single film in my entire career. I'm looking at a piece I wrote for Sight and Sound, which I just found in my Sokurov file. And it begins by me reporting. I say to him, this is a very experimental film. And he looks at me and says, experimental? Never. He says, it's a serious film. And let me just quote you what he said. Whenever I go to the Hermitage, this is Sokurov speaking, and see Rembrandt and El Greco standing behind me, I must always remember that I'm only a film director. In human terms, I can be more, but in the professional sense, cinema is quite a lowly occupation, because there's no tradition of totality or art in cinema. It's both a technical tour de force. It's the first and one of the very few films of its kind that uses the possibility of a very, very high definition video image to give this illusion of continuity. It's not, in fact, as continuous as it appears to be, but that's
these things never are.
No. The sensation is one that you were being whisked through time and through space in one. The phrase he used was a film in a single breath, made in a single breath. I talked to him a lot about that. And of course, it did play a very important part at the beginning of the new millennium, because it did throw us back into, yes, a partial history of Imperial Russia, of course, but it also took us back to a moment of transition, because the end of the film, which I think is immensely moving, that sense that this is all disappearing as the characters who are present at this great ball being held, apparently in the Winter Palace, are going out into the outside world. The mist is rising up off the Neva, the river, and it really is an elegy for the end of the imperial period. And of course, that's quite a provocative thing to do, or you might say it's paving the way for the wave of renunciation of the whole Soviet era, which I suppose Putin stands for in many ways.
Well, I think I hope we can come back in a sec to that question of Russia and empire and what it means exactly, or what we can garner from Sokurov's kind of slightly thorny relationship with those questions. But I think before we get there, seeing as we seem to be progressing roughly chronologically, we should pause to just talk about this tetralogy of power, as you say it's now known, which are these 4 films made between 1997 and 2011, each one about a famous dictatorial figure. So there's Moloch, which is about Hitler. Yeah. Then there's Taurus, which is about the dying days of Lenin.
Yes.
There's The Sun, which is about Emperor Hirohito at the end of the Second World War in Japan. And then he closes it out, interestingly, with Faust in 2011, which is obviously about a fictional character, or kind of fictionalized version of someone who may have been a real historical figure. And that, of course, wins him the Golden Lion at Venice. It's a kind of second capstone on his career, maybe, after his successes in the 90s and the early 2000s. So what is behind this desire on his part over quite a long period of time? So it must have been a very kind of ardent desire to make films about the characters of these grand historical figures. What was he trying to do here? Is there a philosophy of power, a political philosophy that informs all of these films? Why put Hitler, Lenin, and Hirohito on screen like this?
I mean, I think at one point he said, I interviewed him at various points during this process, and something he said sticks in my mind. He said that that this absolute power has a deforming, distorting quality. And that's why, for instance, in Moloch, he has the figures of Hitler and Hitler's court. They're grotesque figures. I mean, they're actually physically grotesque figures lumbering around in great sort of baggy suits.
And I think there's a lot of Hitler in his pants in that film.
Indeed. They're stylistically all different. I mean, although they're grouped together in people's minds and perhaps in his mind even as a kind of series of films, I mean, they couldn't be more different stylistically. So Moloch takes place in this kind of gloomy netherworld. But then again, when we move to The Sun, which is the film about Hirohito, which is, I think, one of his absolute masterpieces. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary film. And it's almost like a sort of, it's almost like a cinema verite film. Part of it really deals with the very last period, the last moments, as it were, of Imperial Japan's career as the Americans close in. But before that, we see Hirohito as this kind of detached, cerebral figure pursuing his scientific interests in a kind of strange world all his own. So I suppose that's saying something about how figures who are caught up in the most horrendous situations, like Japan's war with America, can detach themselves from it and live in their own world. So it's about the possibility of total detachment, not being part of it.
There's something there, isn't there? Like you're saying about absolute power producing this kind of absolute detachment. The kind of the status of absolute power that these figures enjoyed is precisely what has made them into these singular, unapproachable figures. It's just an interesting paradox, I guess, to the task he set himself to attempt to treat these figures like kind of psychologically defined individuals, whilst admitting that they're kind of unapproachable, that they exist in this kind of void that can't be breached, precisely because of their position that they occupy. Which is why they have, again, these films, we keep using this term, they have such a dreamlike quality. Because, narrative, psychological reasoning doesn't seem to have much of a place in these spaces. So they kind of, these films unfold according to the weird internal logic of a Hitler, I guess, or of a Hirohito.
Exactly. And they're mythological figures, but they're also real. And that's why, in a sense, you can add Faust onto the series, as it were, because the question of Faust as a real figure, in a sense, doesn't arise, because Faust is real enough for us because of the various dramas that have been mounted around his character.
And I guess there's a link, a very obvious link, with his latest film, which I think there should still be one screening left of after this episode of the podcast comes out, if people want to rush to get tickets for it, people who live in London. So his latest film, Fairy Tale, is a return to these figures, because it's about Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, and Churchill in purgatory.
Indeed.
It's a combination of animated archival footage and then actors playing the parts, as I understand. So he's clearly, at this late stage in his career and a distance of, 13 years since the Faust film, he's clearly continues to find something in this notion of putting these figures on film. You've seen Fairy Tale. I haven't had a chance to see it yet. Does it seem like a continuation of this project to you?
Well, it seems like a return to it. And these figures, these great figures who came together in the Second World War as allies and opponents of Hitler, as Hitler is in the film as well, of course. They're in some sort of purgatorial afterlife. And you could almost say they're knocking on heaven's door. They're wondering why they're being kept in the anteroom. And it's very literal in a way, because that's indeed what they're in. They're in a kind of strangely literal and yet fantastical sort of Gustave Doré-like world, beautifully realized. they're lifelike, but they're not lifelike. They're in a kind of, they're suspended as if in a purgatory, and they're puzzling about what their position is, what their role is, how do they stand in relation to the ultimate judgment of God. They're wondering where God is and why he isn't on the job. So there's a side to it which is really quite a literal version of, figures waiting at the entrance to heaven. It's an old trope. But at the same time, of course, it's a reflection on the alliance, that strange moment of alliance against Hitler, which brought America, Britain, although America's not in it, interestingly, that brought Britain, America, and Russia together to defeat Hitler.
Well, I guess that gets us onto a question that I did really want to grapple with. So Sokurov has criticized the war on Ukraine, which is all well and good. He's currently, I think, banned from traveling outside of Russia. And Fairy Tale, this new film of his, is not being shown. It's been kind of pulled from screens in Russia. So he's obviously, at the moment, not exactly in favor. But I think the question of his relationship to the Russian establishment, Russian power, and Russian military power in particular is a lot thornier. He is the son of a military officer who kind of traveled around a lot in his childhood as a result of his father's being posted to various locations. And he has returned to the Russian armed forces, the experience of Russian soldiers and sailors and so on, a number of times in his films. When Putin was waging this war on Chechnya in the early 2000s, Sokurov was vocally kind of fairly supportive of what Putin was up to there. And he made a film in 2007 called Aleksandra, which is about the mother of a Russian soldier in Chechnya, which is a open-ended film, but I think certainly one could mount a critique of it. Well, the question I'm getting to behind all this is how do we make sense of a figure like Sokurov now? He's a figure out of time in so many ways. He's kind of the last surviving kind of Soviet-raised Russophone auteur. I mean, Kirill Muratov has died, Alexei German has died,
yes.
Marlon Hutstiev has died, or Alexander Askoldov, Georgy Danelia. All of these figures have died in the last kind of 10, 15 years. And Sokurov is really kind of the last one standing. Yep. But there's a sense in which he's an anachronistic figure, and perhaps that his politics in the kind of post Ukraine war world are anachronistic as well. So I don't know exactly what the question there is, but just that it's interesting. I think it's important to revisit a figure like him now, and to kind of pick out what we can learn from and what we have to be wary of when we're dealing with these kind of grandees of Russian culture.
Well, yes, this is true, but it's a heavy burden that Russian artists carry, and in some ways always have carried. I mean, I've heard, a large part of my life, for strange reasons, has been spent trying to explain aspects of Russian culture to people in the West. I don't know how I fell into this role. And knowing all of those figures that you've mentioned, I knew them all and showed their films and talked to them. And I think it's complex. It's of course it's complex. And I think trying to pin a simple position on a figure like Sokurov is completely impossible. Yes, so that film Alexandra that you mentioned with Wisniewskaya, the great singer, playing a mother who visits her son apparently on the front line in Chechnya, seems outrageous on the face of it. But the actual texture of the film, when you see it, is incredibly tender in all sorts of ways. It's the most unmilitaristic, unpropagandist film imaginable. I don't think the film, strangely enough, does not seem to be endorsing the military project of the war in Chechnya. I don't think it does that. It shows the troops who are deployed in Chechnya. It shows the destruction of the city that they're camped outside. It shows the civilians and their suffering because of the war that's going on all around them. But it doesn't, in a strange way, it doesn't seem to endorse the actual invasion of Chechnya, the Chechen war. And I don't know how it manages to avoid that, but I don't think that it does. And now, you may disagree, but I think the experience of actually watching the film is a very different one from trying to summarize where it stands. And I think that's been true of so many of Sokurov's works. If you summarize them, they seem to be on the wrong side politically. But if you actually experience them emotionally, aesthetically, because they're very beautiful, and the actual quality of the imagery is extraordinary, it's different from that. He takes you inside in a very different way.
There is as well, isn't there? There's something interesting in terms of his relationship with the Caucasus, or the part of the Caucasus that's under Russian control, the North Caucasus, in part because of these films he made about Chechnya, but also because a number of years ago he ran this masterclass in Kabardino-Balkaria, a federal republic that's part of the Russian Federation, that's in the North Caucasus. He ran this filmmaking masterclass there, which was very brief comparatively, but has produced a really quite astonishing number of celebrated young filmmakers as well. Kantemir Balagov, people might be aware of, who made Closeness and Beanpole. Kira Kovalenko, who made a film called Unclenching the Fist, which I think is available to stream for English language audiences. So it's not just an extractive or a nakedly imperialistic position he has in relationship to these places. There is this engagement, and it was quite, he's had this kind of strange, I don't know, third or fourth stage of his career role he's adopted as this kind of this mentor to this new generation of Russian filmmakers.
I think that was a really interesting development when he started to do that. And as you say, there's some outstanding young filmmakers who have emerged through his either teaching or sponsorship. They're not making necessarily Sokurov-like films, but he's certainly been instrumental in opening the way for them and producing some very, very fine work. It's good to know that, if you like, the great tradition of the Russian intelligentsia is still alive and functioning in cinema. And I think he's the main representative of that.
Even if he thinks that cinema is a lowly profession.
Yes, I know. You mentioned Elegy for a Voyage, or Elegy for a Journey, which is one of these it's a marvelous film, short film. He made it at the invitation of the Great Gallery in Rotterdam. And he made it as a piece to be shown on a screen on the wall amongst some of the great masterpieces of world painting that hang in the Boymans Museum. And it's a kind of gesture of humility on his part, that in the film you kind of move through the landscape of some of the great paintings of Western art history. And he wanted film to be in there amongst these great masterpieces, while being very uncertain about the status of cinema in relation to great painting. And yes, he is genuinely rather sort of modest about the film as art, if you like. Whereas, a lot of his own work has got a kind of refinement and an artistic ambition, which places it right up there amongst, the great works of the 21st century.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave it for now. Plenty more to be said about Sokurov. But Ian Christie, thanks so much for stopping back in to tell us all about Aleksandr Sokurov.